There is a file in every galactic archive. It sits in the most restricted section behind layers of encryption that would take a supercomputer 1,000 years to break. Every species that has ever joined the Galactic Council has been given access to this file on their very first day. The ambassador receives it on a small data chip. The instructions are always the same. Read it, memorize it, destroy the chip, and never, under any circumstances, forget what it says. The file contains only one sentence: never harm a human child. Not a rule about borders. Not a regulation about weapons or territory or the movement of fleets. Just that one line. And in the 3,000 years since it was written, no species had ever asked why. Because the ones who needed to ask were no longer around to hear the answer. The galaxy was a busy place. Over 900 known species lived among the stars, spread across billions of worlds in every corner of the observable universe. Some were ancient, their civilizations older than most stars. Some were young, still learning how to travel between their own planets. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, occupying a small and unremarkable arm of a medium-sized spiral galaxy, were the humans. They were not the strongest species. The Gorvathi could crush stone with their bare hands. They were not the fastest. The Silkari could move at speeds that made them invisible to most eyes. They were not the most intelligent in the traditional sense. The Mendari had brains that could process information faster than most computers. But humans had something that no other species in the galaxy possessed, something that made every council member, every admiral, every emperor across the stars treat them with a level of respect that bordered on fear. Humans had rage, not anger. Every species felt anger. The Gorvathi were famous for their temper. The Zelkari were known to destroy their own ships in fits of frustration. But human rage was different. It was not hot and reckless. It was patient. It was absolute. And it did not stop. Not when the enemy surrendered. Not when the battle was over. Not when the war was won. Human rage continued until the thing that caused it no longer existed. Not defeated, not conquered. Erased. And nothing in the universe triggered that rage faster than a threat to their children. Commander Valeth of the Dravari Imperial Fleet stood on the bridge of his warship, the Crimson Fang, and stared at the planet below. It was a small world, barely worth noticing on any star chart. The humans called it Haven, a colony world established about 40 years ago on the edge of their territory. It had green continents and blue oceans, and from orbit it looked peaceful and quiet. According to the intelligence reports, it had a population of roughly 200,000 humans. Most of them were families, farmers, teachers, engineers building a new life far from the crowded cities of Earth and its older colonies. And among those 200,000 humans were approximately 60,000 children. Valeth tapped his claws against the armrest of his command chair. He was a tall creature, even by Dravari standards. His skin was dark grey, almost black, covered in small ridged scales that ran from his forehead down to the base of his spine. His eyes were yellow and narrow, designed for hunting in low light. His people were predators. They had ruled this section of the galaxy for over 500 years, and in that time no one had seriously challenged them. But the humans had been pushing into Dravari space for the last decade. Slowly at first. A research station here. A mining outpost there. Nothing that seemed threatening on its own. But Valeth could see the pattern. Humans were like water. They seeped into every crack, every gap. And before you realized what was happening, they had flooded the entire region. Haven was the latest example. A full colony, with permanent settlements and growing infrastructure, planted firmly in a system that the Dravari considered part of their sphere of influence. The Galactic Council had done nothing about it, of course. They never did when it came to humans. The Council talked endlessly about fairness and balance, but everyone knew the truth. Humans had too many allies, too much economic power, and too many warships for anyone to tell them where they could or could not live. So the Council had simply looked the other way and told the Dravari to file a formal complaint. Valeth was done filing complaints. His fleet consisted of 12 warships, not a massive force by galactic standards, but more than enough for what he had in mind. Haven had no military garrison, no orbital defense platforms, no warships in the system. It was completely unprotected. A soft target. The plan was simple. Drop ground forces into the major settlements, seize control of the colony, and hold the population hostage until the humans agreed to withdraw from Dravari space permanently. His second in command, a younger officer named Torol, stood beside him with a data tablet in his hands. His scales were lighter than Valeth's, a pale grey that marked him as coming from the northern continent of their homeworld. He had been quiet for most of the journey, but now, as they prepared for the operation, he spoke up. "Commander," he said carefully, "I need to raise a concern." Valeth did not look at him. "Speak." "The colony has a large number of children. Our ground forces will be operating in residential areas, near schools and family homes. If there are casualties among the young—" "There will be no casualties," Valeth interrupted. "Our soldiers have their orders. Secure the settlements. Control the population. No unnecessary violence." Toral hesitated. He looked down at his tablet and then back up at the planet spinning slowly below them. "Commander, with respect, I have read the file." The bridge went silent. Every officer, every crew member, stopped what they were doing and looked at Toral. The file. Everyone knew about the file. It was the first thing they taught you at the Imperial Military Academy. Before tactics, before weapons training, before anything else, they sat you down in a room and made you read the file. Valeth finally turned his yellow eyes toward his second in command. "The file," he said slowly, "is propaganda. A story designed to make lesser species afraid of humans. We are not a lesser species, Torol. We are Drivari." "The Kethavari were not a lesser species either," Toral said quietly. Another silence fell over the bridge. The Kethavari. No one spoke that name lightly. They had been a powerful civilization once, hundreds of worlds, a military that rivaled anything in the galaxy. And then, roughly 300 years ago, they had made a mistake. They had raided a human transport ship and taken prisoners. Among those prisoners were 17 children. The humans had asked for them back, politely at first, then firmly, and with an ultimatum that gave the Kethavari exactly 72 hours to return every single child, unharmed, to human space. The Kethavari had laughed. They had broadcast a message across every channel telling the humans that the children would be returned when the humans agreed to surrender. 3 border systems. They thought they were being clever. They thought they had leverage. 72 hours later, the human fleet arrived. Not a patrol, not a task force. The entire fleet. Every warship, every carrier, every fighter, every bomber that humanity possessed came out of faster-than-light travel in Kethavari space at the same moment. The sky above the Kethavari homeworld went dark with human ships. The battle lasted 11 minutes. Not the war. The battle. The initial engagement between the Kethavari defense fleet and the human armada lasted exactly 11 minutes. The Kethavari lost every ship they had. Every single one. The humans did not accept surrenders during that battle. Ships that tried to flee were hunted down. Ships that powered down their weapons and broadcast surrender signals were destroyed anyway. The humans did not speak. They did not negotiate. They did not respond to any communication. They simply fired until there was nothing left to fire at. Then they landed on the Kethavari homeworld. What happened next was not spoken of in detail. The records were sealed. What was known was this: the 17 children were recovered, alive. The Kethavari government was dismantled. Their military was dissolved. Their colonies were placed under human administration. And the Kethavari themselves were reduced from a galactic power to a scattered, broken people who survived only because the humans eventually decided that enough was enough. But the most terrifying part was not the speed of the response or the scale of the destruction. It was what happened to the specific individuals who had been responsible for taking the children. The ones who had planned the raid. The ones who had held the children captive. The ones who had laughed when the humans asked for them back. They were found. Every single one of them. It took the humans 6 years, but they tracked down every officer, every soldier, every politician who had played any role in the kidnapping. Some had fled to the far edges of the galaxy. Some had changed their identities. Some had hidden on worlds that had no treaty with the human government. It did not matter. The humans found them all. None of them were killed. That would have been too simple. Too quick. Instead, they were brought to Earth, to a place called The Hague, and put on trial. The trials were broadcast across the galaxy. Every species watched. And when the verdicts came down, the convicted were sentenced to spend the rest of their natural lives in a human prison, in complete isolation, with nothing but their own thoughts and the knowledge of what they had done and what it had cost their entire civilization. The galaxy learned its lesson that day, and the file was created. Arleth knew the story. Every Dravari knew it. But he also knew that the Kefveri had been fools. They had harmed the children. They had used them as bargaining chips. He had no intention of doing any such thing. His soldiers would secure the colony and keep the population safe. The children would not be touched. He was not starting a war. He was making a political statement. "Begin the operation," he said. The Dravari dropships launched from the fleet and descended toward Haven like a swarm of dark insects. There were 60 of them, each carrying 100 soldiers in full combat armor. They hit the atmosphere at steep angles, trailing fire as they cut through the sky, and within minutes they were landing in and around the 3 major settlements on the planet's surface. The humans were caught completely off guard. It was early morning in the largest settlement, a city called New Greenfield, and the streets were just beginning to fill with people starting their day, parents walking their children to school, workers heading to the farms and factories, shopkeepers opening their stores. The sound of Dravari engines screaming overhead sent everyone running for cover. Valeth watched the operation unfold on the tactical display aboard the Crimson Fang. Green dots represented his soldiers. Blue dots represented the human population. Everything was proceeding according to plan. His forces were fanning out through the settlements, taking control of key buildings, blocking roads, and rounding up civilians into central locations where they could be monitored and controlled. Then a report came in that changed everything. "Commander," the communications officer said, his voice tense. "Ground Team 7 reports contact with human resistance at a primary education facility in New Greenfield." Resistance? The colony has no military.
"It is not military, Commander. It appears to be civilian."
Approximately a dozen humans have barricaded themselves inside the building. They are armed with personal weapons, hunting rifles and sidearms. "A dozen civilians with hunting rifles," Valeth said dismissively. "Tell Ground Team 7 to use non-lethal measures and clear the building." The communications officer relayed the order. For several minutes there was silence. Then the report came back. "Commander, Ground Team 7 has been unable to clear the building. The humans inside are refusing to surrender. They say they have 300 children inside and they will not allow Dravari soldiers to enter." Valeth felt something cold move through his chest. 300 children. He turned to Toral, who was standing very still, his face unreadable. "Order Ground Team 7 to stand down and maintain a perimeter around the building," Valeth said. "No one goes in. No one fires a weapon." "Yes, Commander." But the damage, Valeth would later realize, had already been done. Not because anyone had been hurt. Not because a single shot had been fired at a child, but because in the chaos of the landing, in the terror of dropships screaming over a peaceful colony, something had happened that Valeth had not considered. A child had been hurt. Not by a Dravari soldier, not by a weapon. A 7-year-old girl named Lily Chen had been running with her mother toward a shelter when a Dravari dropship passed overhead at low altitude. The engine washed from the ship, threw the girl off her feet and sent her tumbling across a paved road. She broke her arm and split her forehead open on the concrete. Her mother scooped her up and carried her the rest of the way to the shelter, where a medic set the bone and sealed the wound. It was a minor injury, an accident, the kind of thing that could happen on any day, on any world, from any number of causes. But Lily's mother, holding her bleeding daughter in her arms in that dark shelter, had done something that would set events in motion that the Dravari could not stop, could not control, and would not survive. She had opened her communicator and sent a message to Earth. The message was short. It contained a picture of Lily, her face streaked with blood and tears, her arm bent at a wrong angle, staring at the camera with wide, frightened eyes. Beneath the picture were 4 words: "They are hurting children." The message crossed the vast distance between Haven and Earth at faster-than-light speed, bouncing through relay stations and communication hubs, and within 3 hours it had reached the human homeworld. Within 4 hours it had spread to every human colony, every space station, every ship in the fleet. Within 5 hours, it had been seen by 11 billion people. And somewhere, deep in the headquarters of the United Human Defense Command, a red light began to blink on a console that had not been activated in over 100 years. An officer stared at it for a long moment, then picked up a communicator with hands that were not quite steady. "Get me the Admiral," he said. All of them. Admiral Keiko Tanaka had been asleep when the call came. She had been dreaming about her garden back on Earth. the small patch of land behind her house in Kyoto where she grew tomatoes and sunflowers. In the dream, her granddaughter was there, a 3-year-old with messy hair and dirt on her knees, laughing as she tried to catch a butterfly. It was a good dream, a peaceful one, the kind of dream that reminded her why she had spent 40 years in uniform. The communicator on her bedside table buzzed once, and she was awake, not groggy, not confused, awake the way only someone who had spent a lifetime in the military could be. She picked it up, listened for exactly 12 seconds, and then she was on her feet, pulling on her uniform in the dark. 20 minutes later, she was standing in the war room of the United Human Defense Command, a massive underground facility buried beneath the Swiss Alps. The room was circular, ringed with screens that displayed real-time data from every corner of human space. Normally, most of those screens showed routine information, trade routes, fleet positions, diplomatic schedules. Tonight, every single screen showed the same thing. Lily Chen's face, bloody, terrified. Tanaka stood at the center of the room and looked at the image for a long time. Around her, the other admirals were arriving. Fleet Admiral Morrison, who commanded the First Fleet stationed near Earth. Admiral Okonkwo, who ran the Second Fleet out of the Centauri system. Admiral Petrov, who controlled the Third Fleet along the outer border. And a dozen more, their faces appearing on communication screens as they linked in from ships and stations across human space. No one spoke for nearly a minute. They all just looked at the picture. "Report," Tanaka said finally. Her voice was calm, perfectly controlled. The officers who knew her well recognized that tone. It was not the calm of someone who was relaxed. It was the calm of someone who had already decided what was going to happen and was simply waiting for the machine to start moving. A young intelligence officer stepped forward. His name was Captain Torres, and his hands were trembling slightly as he held his data tablet. "Ma'am, approximately 6 hours ago, a Dravari fleet consisting of 12 warships entered the Haven system and deployed ground forces to the colony surface. They have occupied all 3 major settlements and are holding the civilian population. Current estimates suggest roughly 200,000 humans are under Dravari control, including approximately 60,000 children." "Casualties?" Tanaka asked. "No confirmed deaths, ma'am. Several injuries reported during the initial landing. The most widely circulated report involves a 7-year-old girl injured by engine wash from a low-flying dropship." "The Dravari's stated purpose?" "They have broadcast a demand for all human settlements in what they call their sphere of influence to be evacuated. They are holding the colony population as leverage." Tanaka nodded slowly. She turned to face the ring of screens where her fellow admirals watched. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "the Dravari have landed soldiers on a world with 60,000 human children. They have injured at least 1 child. They are using our families as bargaining chips." The silence in the room was so deep that Torres could hear his own heartbeat. "I am invoking Protocol 7, Tanaka said. The room erupted. Not in argument, in action. Protocol 7 was the oldest and most absolute directive in the human military code. It had been created 300 years ago, in the aftermath of the Kefvari incident, and it had never been invoked since. The protocol was simple. When human children were under direct threat from a hostile alien force, every other military operation, every deployment, every patrol, every exercise was suspended. Every available warship was redirected to a single purpose: the rescue of those children and the complete neutralization of the threat. There was no debate. There was no vote. There was no discussion about proportionality or diplomacy or the political consequences. Protocol 7 did not allow for any of those things. It was an automatic response built into the very foundation of human military doctrine, and it activated like a reflex. Within 1 hour, orders had gone out to every human fleet in the galaxy. Ships that were patrolling trade routes changed course. Ships that were conducting training exercises powered up their weapons. Ships that were in dock for maintenance were declared combat-ready regardless of their condition. Across human space, the largest military mobilization in 3 centuries began to take shape. Meanwhile, on the surface of Haven, things were growing more complicated for Commander Valeth. The occupation had been clean. His soldiers were disciplined and professional. They had rounded up the civilians without violence, set up command posts in the major government buildings, and established a secure perimeter around each settlement. The humans were frightened but unharmed. Everything was under control, except for the schools. There were 14 schools across the 3 settlements of Haven. When the Dravari dropships had appeared in the sky, every school on the planet had gone into immediate lockdown. Doors were sealed, windows were barricaded, and the teachers, the administrators, and every parent who happened to be nearby had armed themselves with whatever they could find and taken up positions inside. Valeth had ordered his soldiers to leave the schools alone. Do not approach. Do not threaten. Do not even look at them too aggressively. He understood, at least in theory, the sensitivity of the situation. But what he did not understand, what he could not have understood because he was not human, was what was happening inside those buildings. He did not understand that a human teacher with 30 children behind her was not a frightened civilian waiting to be rescued. She was something far more dangerous. She was a barrier that would not move. She was a wall made of bone and will, and the kind of love that does not calculate odds or weigh consequences. Every teacher in every school on Haven had made the same quiet, absolute decision in the first seconds of the invasion. They would not let the aliens reach their students, not while they were breathing, not while they could hold a door shut, or swing a chair, or stand between a child and a weapon. This was not bravery in the way that soldiers understood bravery. It was not courage weighed against fear. It was something deeper, something that came from a place in the human mind that predated civilization, predated language, predated everything except the oldest and most powerful instinct that existed. Protect the young, at any cost, without hesitation, without limit. In New Greenfield's largest primary school, a woman named Sarah Okafor stood behind the front doors with a hunting rifle her husband had brought from their home. She was a mathematics teacher. She had never fired a weapon at a living thing in her life. Her hands were steady. Behind her, in the gymnasium, 412 children sat in rows on the floor, watched over by the other teachers and several parents who had managed to reach the school before the Dravari locked down the streets. The children were scared. Some of the younger ones were crying, but the older ones, the 10 and 11-year-olds, were doing something that would have surprised the Dravari if they had been watching. They were comforting the little ones. They were sharing snacks from their lunchboxes. They were telling stories and playing quiet games and doing everything they could to keep the smaller children calm. Because even at that age, human children understood something fundamental about their situation. The adults were protecting them, and they could help by being brave. Sarah watched the Dravari soldiers through a gap in the barricade. They were standing about 50 meters from the building, their weapons visible but not aimed. They seemed uncertain. She did not care. If any of them took a single step closer, she would fire. She would miss, probably. She would accomplish nothing strategic, and it would not matter, because the act of resistance itself would mean something. It would mean that the Dravari had to fight to reach the children. It would mean that reaching them was not easy. It would mean that there was a cost. And Sarah knew something else. She knew that the message had been sent. She knew that somewhere out there the people who could actually do something about this situation had seen it, and she knew what was coming. In orbit above Haven, Valeth received a communication from the Dravari homeworld. It was from the Imperial Council, the ruling body of the Dravari Empire, and the message was frantic. Commander Valeth, you are ordered to withdraw from Haven immediately. Repeat, immediately. Human fleet movements have been detected across multiple sectors. This is not a local response. All indications suggest a full military mobilization. You must withdraw before. Valeth cut the transmission. He stood on his bridge and stared at the tactical display. And for the first time in his long career, he felt something he did not recognize. It was cold. It started in his stomach and spread outward through his limbs. His claws, which had been tapping confidently against his armrest for days, were still. Communications, he said. Get me a channel to the human government. Commander, we have been attempting to establish communication with the human authorities since the operation began. They are not responding. They are not responding, Valeth repeated. No, Commander. All channels are silent. Taral stepped forward. His face was grim. Commander, the Kethvari sent surrender signals too. The humans did not respond to those either. Before Valeth could reply, the sensor officer spoke up, and his voice cracked as he did. Commander, faster-than-light signatures detected at the edge of the system. How many ships? Valeth asked. The sensor officer stared at his screen. He adjusted his instruments. He ran the scan again. Then he looked up at Valeth with an expression that the commander had never seen on a Dravari face before. It was not fear, exactly. It was the expression of someone who has just realized that they are standing on the edge of a cliff in the dark and the ground beneath their feet is already crumbling. "Commander," he said, "I cannot count them. The first human ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the outer edge of the Haven system. Then more arrived, and more and more. They kept coming, wave after wave, filling the space around Haven like stars being born. Destroyers, cruisers, battleships, carriers, dreadnoughts. Ships that Valeth had only seen in intelligence reports. Ships that he had been told were stationed on the other side of human space. Ships that should not have been able to reach Haven for weeks. They had come in days. The human fleet did not arrange itself into a battle formation. It did not need to. It simply surrounded the system. Every possible escape route, every vector, every direction that the Dravari ships could flee was blocked by a wall of human warships. Valeth's 12 ships sat in orbit around Haven like insects caught in a glass jar. And then, finally, the humans spoke. A single transmission came through on the universal communication frequency. It was not from an admiral. It was not from a politician. It was from the fleet itself, an automated message broadcast on repeat. "This is the United Human Defense Force. You are in possession of a human colony containing children. You will power down all weapons. You will recall all ground forces to your ships. You will not damage any infrastructure. You will not harm any civilian. You will comply with these instructions within 60 minutes. There will be no negotiation. There will be no extension. There will be no second warning." Valeth listened to the message play 3 times. Then he looked out the viewport of the Crimson Fang, and he saw the human fleet with his own eyes. It filled the sky. It stretched from horizon to horizon, a field of angular, grey warships that blotted out the stars. "Commander," Toral said quietly, "what are your orders?" Valeth closed his eyes. He thought about his empire. He thought about his pride. He thought about the 500 years of Dravari dominance and the honor of his fleet and the strength of his people. Then he thought about the file. He opened his eyes. "Power down all weapons," he said. "Recall the ground forces!" The bridge crew moved instantly. There was no hesitation, no objection. They had seen the fleet. They had counted the ships, or tried to, and they had realized the same thing that their commander had realized. This was not a battle they could fight. This was not even a war they could survive. This was a force of nature. This was a flood, a hurricane, an earthquake. You did not fight these things. You got out of the way, or you were destroyed. On the surface of Haven, the Dravari soldiers received the order to withdraw. They moved quickly, efficiently, professionally. Within 30 minutes, every Dravari soldier on the planet was back aboard a dropship, lifting off from the settlements they had occupied just hours before. Sarah Okafor watched from the window of the school as the last dropship climbed into the sky and disappeared. She lowered her rifle. Her hands were shaking now. Behind her, the children were cheering, hugging each other, some of them crying with relief. The other teachers were opening the barricades, letting in fresh air and sunlight. But Sarah did not cheer. She did not smile, because she had been watching the news feeds on her communicator, and she knew that this was not over. The Dravari were leaving Haven. That was good. But the human fleet was still out there, and it had not come all this way just to accept a surrender. In orbit, Valeth completed the withdrawal exactly within the 60-minute window. His weapons were powered down. His soldiers were aboard. His ship sat motionless and dark in orbit, waiting. The human fleet did not fire. It did not move. It simply remained where it was, that enormous ring of warships surrounding the system, like the bars of a cage. And then a new transmission came through. And this one was not automated. It was a live communication, voice only, from a human admiral. "Commander Valeth of the Dravari Imperial Fleet," the voice said. It was a woman's voice, calm and precise, with an accent that Valeth's translator could not quite place. "This is Admiral Keiko Tanaka of the United Human Defense Force. You have complied with our initial instructions. Your cooperation is noted." Valeth felt a brief flash of relief. It died quickly when Tanaka continued speaking. "You will now escort your fleet under our guidance to the following coordinates. Your ships will be boarded and inspected. Your soldiers will be interviewed individually. Any equipment or data related to this operation will be confiscated. Once this process is complete, you will be escorted to the border of human space and released." She paused, and when she spoke again, Her voice had changed. It was no longer calm. It was something else entirely. Something that Valeth felt in his bones. "Commander, I want you to understand something. A child was hurt today, a 7-year-old girl. She was bleeding and afraid, and she did not understand why strangers came from the sky to her home. You did not hurt her deliberately. I believe that. It does not matter. She was hurt because you came. And because you came, the people of Haven spent hours in terror, not knowing if their children would live or die. Mothers held their babies in shelters and listened to your ships overhead, and imagined the worst things that any parent can imagine." The transmission was silent for a moment. "You are being released today because no child was killed. Because your soldiers, to their credit, showed restraint. Because this situation can still end without the kind of consequences that the Kethvari faced. But understand this, Commander. I have 437 warships in this system right now. I moved them across the galaxy in less than 72 hours. I abandoned every other operation, every other priority, every other commitment that the human military has, and I sent everything here for one colony. For one child with a broken arm and a cut on her forehead." Another pause. "Imagine what I would have done if she had died." The transmission ended. Valeth sat in his chair for a long time, staring at nothing. Around him, his bridge crew worked in silence, following the human fleet's instructions, preparing to be escorted out of the system like criminals being led away in chains. Doral stood beside him. After a while he spoke. "The file was not propaganda," he said. Valeth did not answer. He did not need to. They both knew the truth now. They had seen it with their own eyes, felt it in the shaking of their hands, heard it in the voice of a human admiral who had crossed the galaxy in 3 days because a 7-year-old girl had scraped her forehead. The Dravari fleet began to move, guided by human escort ships toward the designated coordinates. Behind them, the planet Haven turned slowly in the light of its star, green and blue and beautiful. And in a school in New Greenfield, a mathematics teacher named Sarah Okafor finally put down her rifle and cried. The Galactic Council chamber on the station, called Nexus Prime, was the largest enclosed space ever constructed by any civilization. It was a dome nearly 2 kilometers across, built in orbit around a neutral star that belonged to no species, floating in the black between empires like a lighthouse on a dark sea. Inside that dome, representatives of over 900 species gathered to debate, argue, negotiate, and occasionally threaten each other in the endless process of keeping the galaxy from tearing itself apart. Today, the chamber was completely full. Every seat was taken. Every gallery was packed. Species that had not sent an ambassador to the Council in decades had dispatched representatives specifically for this session. The air recyclers hummed at maximum capacity, struggling to maintain a breathable atmosphere for hundreds of different biological needs. The translation systems worked overtime, converting a single spoken sentence into 917 different languages simultaneously. At the center of the chamber, in the speaking circle reserved for matters of the highest importance, stood 2 delegations. On one side, the Dravari. Their ambassador, a senior diplomat named Kelvarath, wore the formal robes of the imperial court. His scales were polished to a deep shine, and his posture was rigid with the effort of maintaining dignity in what everyone in the chamber understood was an impossible situation. Behind him stood 6 advisors, their eyes fixed on the floor. On the other side stood the human delegation. Ambassador Elena Vasquez, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back from a face that showed every year of a career spent navigating the most dangerous political waters in the galaxy. She wore a simple dark suit, no medals, no decorations. She did not need them. Every being in the chamber knew who she was and what she represented. Between the 2 delegations, floating in the air as a holographic projection visible to every seat in the chamber, was a photograph. A 7-year-old girl with blood on her face and tears in her eyes, her arm bent at the wrong angle, staring into the camera with an expression that had already been burned into the collective memory of every species that had seen it. Lily Chen had become the most famous child in the galaxy. The council speaker, a being from the ancient Morvathi species who served as the neutral moderator of all sessions, activated the speaking protocols with a low chime that echoed through the enormous space. Its name was Thelcora, and it had held the speaker's position for over a century. In that time, it had moderated territorial disputes, trade wars, and conflicts that had threatened millions of lives. but it had never felt the chamber vibrate with the kind of tension it felt today. This emergency session of the Galactic Council has been convened at the request of the United Human Federation, Thelcora announced, its voice carrying through every speaker and translator in the dome. The matter before us is the unauthorized military occupation of the human colony World Haven by forces of the Dravari Empire. Ambassador Vasquez, you may present your statement. Elena Vasquez stepped forward into the center of the speaking circle. She looked up at the tiers of seats rising around her, at the hundreds of alien faces watching her, at the cameras that would broadcast her words to trillions of beings across the galaxy. She took a breath. 3 days ago, she began, 12 Dravari warships entered the Haven system and deployed 6,000 armed soldiers to a colony of 200,000 civilians. They occupied our settlements. They blocked our roads. They surrounded our schools. They pointed weapons at our people. And in the process, they injured a child. She let the words hang in the air. The chamber was completely silent. The Dravari will tell you that this was a political action, a dispute over territory, a disagreement about borders that got out of hand. They will tell you that no one was supposed to be hurt, that the injury to Lily Chen was an accident. And perhaps that is true. Perhaps Commander Violet genuinely believed that he could land an army on a world full of families and children, and no one would be harmed. Vasquez turned to face the Dravari delegation directly. Kelvarath met her eyes, but just barely. But that belief itself is the problem, she continued, because it tells us that Commander Valeth, and by extension the Dravari imperial government that authorized this operation, made a calculation. They weighed the risks. They considered the possibilities. And they decided that the presence of 60,000 children on that colony was an acceptable variable in their political equation. They decided that our children were pieces on a game board. She turned back to the full chamber. I want every species in this room to understand something. Human children are not variables. They are not leverage. They are not bargaining chips, hostages, or acceptable risks. They are children. And there is no political goal, no territorial claim, no strategic objective in this galaxy that is worth the terror that those children felt when alien soldiers landed in their neighborhoods. A murmur went through the chamber. Not disagreement. Something deeper. Recognition. Because every species in the galaxy reproduced in some fashion, and most of them had some instinct, some drive, some biological imperative to protect their young. The humans were extreme in the intensity of that drive, yes, but they were not alone in understanding it. Kelvarath stepped forward when it was his turn to speak. He was a skilled diplomat, and he did his best. He expressed regret for the incident. He acknowledged that the operation had been poorly conceived. He offered reparations to the colony. He proposed a new bilateral agreement on border territories that would resolve the underlying dispute. He did not apologize. The Dravari Empire did not apologize. It was not in their nature, and their government had specifically instructed him not to use that word. They had calculated that an apology would be seen as weakness, and that weakness would invite further encroachment on their territory. It was the wrong calculation. When Calvarath finished speaking, Vasquez responded, "The Dravari ambassador offers reparations and a border agreement. These things can be discussed through normal diplomatic channels. But this session is not about borders. It is about something more fundamental." She reached into her jacket and produced a small data chip. She held it up so the cameras could see it. Every species in this room received one of these on the day they joined the council. Every ambassador read what was on it. Some of you read it centuries ago. Some of you read it last year. But you all know what it says. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, which somehow made it more. Never harm a human child. That is the first law of this galaxy. Not because we wrote it, not because we imposed it, but because 300 years ago, the consequences of breaking it were so severe, so absolute, so disproportionate to anything anyone had ever seen, that every species in this galaxy collectively decided that it was easier to make it a law than to risk seeing it happen again. She lowered the chip. The Dravari did not kill a child. They did not intend to harm a child, but they created a situation where children were in danger, where children were terrified, and where at least one child was physically injured. And they did this deliberately, knowingly, as an act of political leverage. We are not asking for war. We are not asking for the destruction of the Dravari Empire. We are asking this council to do what it should have done before. We are asking you to take the file, the one-sentence warning that every species receives and then files away and tries to forget about, and turn it into formal galactic law. Not a suggestion, not a guideline. Law. With consequences defined and agreed upon by every member of this council. The debate that followed lasted for 7 hours. Species argued, delegations consulted with their homeworlds, legal experts debated the wording of the proposed statute. Some species were hesitant, not because they disagreed with the principle, but because they feared setting a precedent. If attacking human children was formally outlawed, what about the children of other species? Should the same protection apply to everyone? It was the ambassador from the Vrelian Confederation, a small amphibian species known for their philosophical traditions, who stood up and said what many were thinking. With respect to the chamber, we are dancing around the obvious. The protection we are discussing is not really about law, it is about consequences. The HFY did not violate a law when they took those human children 3 centuries ago. There was no law to violate. They were destroyed anyway. The Dravari have not violated a law today, and yet 400 human warships materialized in their system within 72 hours. We are not creating a law because we believe in the principle, though we should. We are creating a law because if we do not, someday, some species will make a mistake and the humans will respond. And this time, the response may be so extreme that it destabilizes the entire galactic order. The Vrelian paused and looked around the chamber. We are not protecting children from humans. We are protecting the galaxy from what humans become when their children are threatened. The chamber was silent for a long time after that. In the end, the vote was nearly unanimous. 904 species voted in favor. 11 abstained, 2 voted against, and both of those changed their votes within the hour after receiving communications from their homeworlds. The formal statute was entered into galactic law with the following text. No military force of any species shall engage in any action that places the children of any council member species in danger, whether through direct violence, occupation, seizure, hostage-taking, or any other means. Violation of this statute shall be considered an act of aggression against the entire Galactic Council and shall be met with the full collective response of all member species. The Dravari Empire was sanctioned, not destroyed, not dismantled, sanctioned. Their fleet was reduced by treaty. Their border claims were formally denied. They were required to pay reparations to the colony of Haven for a period of 50 years, and Commander Valeth was required to stand before the Council and personally acknowledge the harm his actions had caused. He did so with rigid dignity. He stood in the speaking circle in his military uniform, looking up at the 900 species that judged him, and he spoke the words that his government had written for him. They were stiff and formal and carefully worded to avoid actual admission of wrongdoing, while expressing sufficient regret to satisfy the terms of the agreement. The chamber accepted them without enthusiasm, but what happened next was not part of any agreement or treaty or formal proceeding. As Violet turned to leave the speaking circle, Ambassador Vasquez stepped forward and spoke his name. He stopped and faced her. The chamber, which had been filling with the noise of delegations preparing to leave, fell silent again. "Commander," Vasquez said, "before you go, there is someone who wants to speak with you." A side door in the chamber opened, and a woman walked in holding the hand of a small girl. The woman was Mei Chen, Lily's mother, a woman who 3 days ago had carried her bleeding daughter through the streets of New Greenfield while alien dropships screamed overhead. She looked tired. She looked like she had not slept in days. Lily walked beside her. Her arm was in a small cast, decorated with colorful stickers that the other children at the shelter had given her. The cut on her forehead had been sealed with medical glue, leaving a thin pink line above her left eyebrow. She looked around the enormous chamber with wide eyes, taking in the vast space and the hundreds of alien faces looking down at her. The chamber held its breath. Mei Chen stopped a few meters from Valeth. She looked at him, this tall, grey alien with scales and yellow eyes, and for a moment there was something hard and bright in her expression. Anger. The kind of anger that mothers carry in their bones, the kind that never fully goes away, that lives in the space between the ribs and flares hot every time they remember the moment their child was in danger. But she did not speak. Instead, she looked down at Lily. And Lily looked up at Valeth. The Dravari commander stared down at the small human child. She came up to his knee. She weighed perhaps 22 kilograms. She was, by any objective measure, one of the most physically fragile beings in the entire chamber. Her bones were thin, her skin was soft. She had no claws, no scales, no natural armor of any kind. She was small and breakable and utterly, completely vulnerable, and she had nearly caused the destruction of his empire. Lily looked at him for a long moment with the simple, unfiltered directness that only children possess. Then she held up her cast-covered arm and said, in a clear, small voice that the chamber's audio systems carried to every corner of the dome, "You broke my arm." 900 species heard those 4 words. 900 species watched the most powerful military commander in the Dravari Empire stand frozen in front of a 7-year-old girl. 900 species waited to see what would happen next. Valith looked at the child. He looked at the cast on her arm, covered in stickers and small drawings from other children. He looked at the thin pink scar on her forehead, and something changed in his face. The rigid military bearing softened. The yellow eyes, designed by evolution for hunting, grew less sharp. His claws, which could tear through metal, hung limp at his sides. "Yes," he said. His voice was rough. "I did." There was no defense, no explanation, no political qualification, just a simple admission from a predator to the smallest creature in the room. Lily considered this for a moment. Then she said, "It hurt." "I know," Vela said. "I am sorry." The words came out before he could stop them. The words his government had specifically instructed him not to say. The words that the entire Dravari diplomatic strategy had been built around avoiding. They came out anyway because he was looking at a child with a broken arm, and he had broken it, and there was no word in any language that meant anything other than sorry. Lily nodded seriously, the way children do when they are processing something important. Then she turned to her mother, who was crying quietly, and said, "Can we go home now?" Mei-chan picked up her daughter. She looked at Valith one more time. The anger was still there, but something else was there too. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But an acknowledgement that this creature, this alien commander who had invaded her world and hurt her daughter, had looked her child in the eye and told her the truth. She turned and walked out of the chamber. The door closed behind them. The session was formally adjourned minutes later, but no one moved for a long time. The image of a 7-year-old girl holding up a broken arm to an alien warlord had been captured by every camera in the chamber, and within hours it would join the photograph of her bloody face as one of the most widely distributed images in galactic history. 6 months later, the Galactic archive was updated. The restricted file that every new species received on their first day at the Council was not changed. It still contained the same single sentence it had always contained: "Never harm a human child." But a second file was added beside it. This one was not encrypted. It was not restricted. It was freely available to anyone who wanted to read it. It contained a detailed account of everything that had happened at Haven, the invasion, the response, the 400 ships that crossed the galaxy in 3 days, the trial, the law, and at the very end a short passage that was written not by a historian or a diplomat but by Thelkura, the council speaker who had watched 900 species hold their breath while a 7-year-old girl confronted the commander who had broken her arm. The passage read simply this: "We asked the human ambassador, after the session was over, why humans respond the way they do when their children are threatened, why the reaction is so extreme, why the entire species mobilizes, why their military abandons every other priority, why their rage is so total and so absolute." We expected a complex answer. A discussion of evolutionary biology perhaps, or social psychology, or the deep cultural significance of family in human civilization. Ambassador Vasquez looked at us as if we had asked why stars produce light, and then she said, "Because they are our children." We asked if there was more to it than that. She said no, that was all. They are our children. And in the simplicity of that answer, we understood at last why the first law of the galaxy is what it is, and why it will never need to be enforced again. Because the humans have already made the consequences clear, and the galaxy has a long memory. The file was closed, the archive was sealed, and across the vast spinning galaxy, with its billions of worlds and its trillions of lives and its endless ancient quarrels, one law stood above all others, unbroken, unchallenged, absolute. Never harm a human child, not because a council decreed it, not because a treaty demanded it, but because every species that looked into the eyes of humanity when their children were in danger saw something there that went beyond military power, beyond technology, beyond strategy or politics or the cold logic of interstellar warfare. They saw a species that would burn the galaxy to the ground to protect a 7-year-old girl with a broken arm. And they decided, wisely, never to test that resolve again.